I watched the phone ring again and again, hoping it was him. My son, the one I raised, canceled Christmas at the very last minute. All those years I cooked, worried, and saved for this dinner. And now, I was left alone in a house full of memories. But as the snow fell quietly outside, I realized I had one choice left, a decision he would never, ever expect. Hit subscribe if you believe life always finds a way to balance the scales. Because this story proves it. I watched the phone sit on the counter, its screen lighting up for the 10th time in an hour, and I felt a hollow ache in my chest. Every ring was a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, it was him calling to say he was on his way. But deep down I knew. My son had canceled Christmas dinner again, at the last minute, and somehow, each time, it hurt worse than the one before. I had spent days planning tonight, decorating the house just like we used to when my wife was alive, making the mashed potatoes the way he always liked, setting the table with the good china that hadn't seen use in years. Every little detail had been a hope that he would come, a hope I had stubbornly held on to, even though life and distance had been chipping away at our relationship for years. I stood in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter, staring at the phone, like it might magically ring with different news, if I just willed it hard enough. I could hear the faint hum of Christmas music from the speaker in the corner, a soft medley that my wife used to sing along with. I used to sing too. Once, until the loneliness had started to drown out the notes. The smell of roasting turkey filled the air, mingling with the piney scent of the tree in the corner. Everything was perfect, and yet, the emptiness pressed down on me like a heavy, invisible weight. I thought about the last time I had seen him, how proud I had felt when he moved out on his own, how I had imagined this night in my head for years. Him walking through the door, laughter spilling out, hugging me like nothing had ever changed. But that image had become a ghost. It hovered over the house, reminding me of what should have been, mocking the silence that had taken its place. I had called him that morning, trying to sound casual, but my voice had betrayed the hope I was trying to hide. "Hey, Dad," he had said, and I could tell instantly from the tone that it wasn't going to be good. There was a hesitation, a sort of awkwardness that always preceded disappointment. I don't think we're going to make it tonight." The words landed like a slap across my face. My chest tightened, and I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "What do you mean you're not coming?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though the hurt was creeping in anyway. "It's Christmas. We've been planning this." "I know, Dad," he said, voice almost apologetic. "But something came up with Jenna's family." "I'm sorry, I really am. Can we maybe another time?" Another time, the same phrase he had used countless times before. Every year, some excuse, some emergency. Some reason why Christmas dinner with me wasn't a priority. And yet, the worst part wasn't the cancellation. It was the casual way he said it. As if he didn't even realize what he was doing. As if he didn't understand the weight of the emptiness he was leaving behind. I ended the call with a quiet, "Okay," and set the phone down, my fingers lingering over it for a long moment. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in a long time. But the silence around me felt like it had taken over the room, pressing into every corner, filling the spaces where laughter and conversation should have been. I walked over to the window and looked out at the snow falling softly, covering the world in white, serene and silent. The neighbors were all inside, I imagined, gathered with their families, their homes filled with the warmth I had been denied. I turned back to the kitchen. The turkey was almost done. The rolls had been baked to a golden perfection, and the sweet smell of cinnamon and nutmeg from the pies made the air taste like Christmas. I had set the table with care, placing the silverware just so, folding the napkins into little triangles that stood proudly on the plates. I had even strung a few extra lights around the mantel, hoping to make the room feel festive, to fill the corners of my heart with something. Anything that could mimic the joy I had hoped to share with him. I sank into a chair at the head of the table, staring at the empty chair across from me. My mind wandered back through the years. I remembered his first Christmas. How he had squealed with delight when he saw the little tree in the living room, how he had tugged at my hand, insisting we open the presents immediately. I remembered the messy decorations, the glitter stuck to the carpet, the chaos and laughter. Those were the nights that had felt so alive, so full of promise. And now nothing. Just this cold, still silence. It wasn't just Christmas. It was a pattern, a slow unraveling of the bond I had once cherished. He had moved on, built a life with his wife, and in the process, I had become a fixture in the background of their plans, someone they thought of occasionally, like an afterthought. And every time I tried to reach out, every time I tried to be present, it felt like I was pushing against a wall. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight, I had hoped, would remind him of the family we once were, of the love that had built him, shaped him. But he had chosen something else, someone else, leaving me alone in the world I had tried to make warm and inviting. I tried to shake off the bitterness, reminding myself that anger wouldn't help. I had spent years teaching him to be compassionate, patient, responsible. Surely, somewhere deep down, he remembered those lessons. Surely, he would see tonight not just as a cancellation, but as a moment of consequence. Though right now, I doubted it. I moved around the kitchen, putting finishing touches on the meal, chopping parsley for garnish, fluffing the mashed potatoes, arranging the cranberry sauce just so. It was almost ritualistic, a way to ground myself in something tangible when my heart felt so untethered. I paused and looked at the clock. Dinner was ready. Everything was ready. The house smelled like warmth and care, and yet the warmth felt hollow without him here to share it. I sat down again, sighing deeply, and let my mind wander. I thought about calling him again, begging him to come, pleading with him to remember what Christmas meant. But some small voice inside stopped me. Not this time. Not tonight. If he couldn't value the years I had given him, the love I had poured into his life, then it wasn't my place to chase him. I looked around at the lights on the tree, the ornaments catching the glow, and reflecting tiny rainbows on the walls. I could almost hear my wife's voice in the room, soft and comforting, reminding me that love wasn't measured by presence alone. Maybe that was what I needed to remind myself tonight, that my value, my dignity, wasn't tied to whether my son showed up at a dinner table I had set with my own hands. The phone rang again. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. I already knew what it would say. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the snow blanket the world in quiet. And in that stillness, a strange clarity began to form. Maybe this year, I thought, it wouldn't be about trying to make him see me. Maybe it would be about making a choice that finally reminded him what he had been missing. For the first time in hours, a small, stubborn sense of resolve flickered to life inside me. I didn't know what the exact decision would be, but I felt it take shape, a quiet, firm action that would no longer place my happiness at the mercy of someone who hadn't learned to value it. I imagined his shock, his surprise, the realization that I wasn't just a background character in his life anymore. He would notice. Oh, he would notice. And for the first time tonight, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. I got up from the chair and walked over to the table, running my hand along the edge, straightening a napkin here, moving a fork there. Every detail was perfect, every piece in its place. And yet, The perfection wasn't for him. It was for me. It was proof that I could create warmth, love, and care in a world that sometimes refused to give it back. And when I stepped back and looked at the empty chair, I didn't feel despair anymore. I felt anticipation for the moment he would finally see that I wasn't just waiting for him anymore. I had plans now, and he had no idea. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the world in a blanket of quiet. Inside, I sat back down, glass of wine in hand, staring at the empty chair with a calm I hadn't felt in years. This Christmas, I realized, wouldn't be about the absence of my son. It would be about the presence of my own resolve, the quiet power of a man who had been hurt but refused to be broken. And in that thought, I finally felt a spark of hope. A spark that was all mine. The house was silent, the tree lights twinkling, the food perfectly arranged. And in that silence, I began to craft my plan. A plan that would ensure he never forgot what it meant to take someone for granted. A plan that would remind him, in the quietest, most unexpected way, that the love he thought he could ignore was stronger than he imagined. Tonight, he had left me alone. But tomorrow, I would no longer be just the man waiting. I would be the man in control. And that realization, more than anything else, filled me with a quiet, thrilling satisfaction. I spent the night alone, the house quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. After putting the dishes away and clearing the counters, I moved slowly from room to room, glancing at the little traces of the past. Christmas was supposed to be about warmth, togetherness, and laughter, but tonight it was a museum of memories. Each ornament on the tree, each framed photograph on the mantel, seemed to mock me quietly. My son had grown up in this house, had learned to take for granted the labor and love that had filled every corner. And yet, despite that hurt, I couldn't summon anger. Not yet. Anger is easy. Hurt is more complicated. Hurt makes you see the cracks, makes you think about what could have been, and forces you to question yourself. I wandered to the living room, my fingers brushing over the spine of a photo album on the shelf. The leather was worn, the pages yellowed, but the pictures inside were still sharp. I opened it slowly, hesitating as though the act itself could hurt me more than the memories ever had. The first photograph was from his 5th Christmas. He was wearing that ridiculous red sweater with reindeer on it, a bright smile stretching across his face, eyes sparkling with delight as he tore open a gift. I could hear his laughter in my mind, remember the way he had jumped up and down, barely able to contain himself. My chest tightened, and I had to take a deep breath to steady myself. That laughter had once filled this house every year, and now it was gone, replaced with silence and a sense of absence that cut deeper than anything else. I turned the pages slowly, each one a journey through his childhood. There was the messy Christmas where the tree had fallen over, needles scattering across the floor, and he had tried to hold it upright with his small hands, giggling the entire time. There was the year he had insisted on helping me make cookies, smearing flour across the counter, his face dusted with white, his eyes shining with pride at his creations. I could almost hear my wife scolding us gently, reminding us that the kitchen was not a place for chaos, and then laugh when she realized she was caught up in the fun herself. Those were the moments I lived for, the moments that had made me a father, made me feel like I mattered in his world. And now he had canceled. Again. The thought twisted in my chest like a knife. I had prepared everything, expected him to walk through the door and fill the empty spaces with his voice, with stories, with that energy only he could bring. But he hadn't. And yet, strangely, it wasn't resentment that filled me as I sat there flipping through these pages. It was clarity. I realized that I had spent too long hoping for a change that might never come, Too long giving and forgiving without considering what I deserved in return. I wasn't just a father. I was a man with a life of my own, a history, a sense of pride that didn't need to be validated by his presence. I closed the album and leaned back in the chair, letting my thoughts drift to the years that had passed since he had moved out. I had been proud of him, of course, but I had also been naive. I had assumed that love alone would keep the bond alive, that the lessons I had taught, the sacrifices I had made, would ensure he always remembered the importance of family. But people grow in their own directions, and sometimes those directions leave you behind. I remembered the small signs, the phone calls that became less frequent, the messages that were polite but distant, the little excuses that became a pattern. And tonight had just confirmed it all. Yet, beneath the hurt, I felt something else stirring, a quiet determination. I realized that I had spent years allowing myself to be hurt without responding, allowing him to shape my emotions simply by his choices. That ends now. I wasn't going to yell, or beg, or cry. I wasn't going to set a trap or plan revenge in a petty sense. But I would act. I would make a choice that mattered, one that would finally put me back in control of my life, and make him see, not through anger, but through consequence, what it meant to ignore the people who had shaped you. I poured myself another glass of wine and sat by the fireplace, letting the warmth seep into my hands. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows across the room, and I thought about all the Christmases we had shared, all the laughter and chaos that had once filled this very space. My mind wandered, as it always did on nights like this, to the question of what I had missed, what I had given, and what I deserved. I had been patient, loyal, and generous, and yet that generosity had been taken for granted. How often had I sacrificed my own comfort for the sake of keeping peace, for the sake of making sure everyone else was happy? Too often, I realized, and tonight, it became painfully clear. I could no longer be a background character in my own story. I began to think about the possibilities, the quiet ways I could assert myself without causing chaos, without burning bridges unnecessarily. There were many paths I could take, some that would shock him, some that would gently remind him, and some that would change the way he saw me forever. I thought about the house, about the traditions, about the very act of preparing a meal that went unappreciated. Perhaps it was time to redirect that energy, to make this Christmas about something more than waiting for someone who didn't value my presence. Maybe it was time to share what I had with people who would truly recognize it, who would be grateful, who would honor it with their appreciation. I walked to the window and looked out at the snow falling quietly. I imagined the neighbors, families laughing, children playing, their houses warm and alive. I felt a pang of envy, yes, but also a sense of freedom. I could create my own warmth, my own joy, without needing his approval. I thought about calling him again, leaving a message, letting him know how hurt I was. But I didn't. That would be too easy, too reactive. This had to be deliberate, quiet, something that carried weight precisely because it wasn't angry, because it wasn't obvious. I wanted him to see me, truly see me, for the man I had become in spite of the disappointment, not in response to it. Memories continued to wash over me, and I let them guide my thoughts. I thought about his first steps, the night he had fallen and scraped his knee. How I had held him and cleaned the wound, telling him that pain was part of life, but didn't define him. I thought about the time he had lost a science fair project and cried for hours, and how I had stayed up late helping him rebuild it, piece by piece. I realized that I had been shaping him for decades, investing myself in his growth, teaching him resilience and compassion. And yet, tonight, all that investment seemed invisible to him. That was the reality I had to confront. But even as the sadness lingered, I felt a growing sense of empowerment. I was done waiting for recognition. I didn't need it from him to know my own worth. I realized that this Christmas could be different. Not because he was here, but because I was ready to reclaim it. To take control of the joy and meaning I had always associated with this time of year. I thought about the people I had helped over the years, neighbors who had fallen on hard times, friends who had been lonely, strangers who had needed a hand. Perhaps they would understand. Perhaps they would bring the kind of presents I had been longing for. Perhaps, for the first time in a long time, I could celebrate the holiday without the shadow of disappointment looming over me. I began to imagine the possibilities, and with each one, my resolve strengthened. I could invite people who truly appreciated me, who respected my efforts, who valued my presence. I could create a gathering that mattered, one that honored my life and my contributions. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that if my son were to learn of it, he would be forced to confront the consequences of his choices. Not through shame, not through anger, but through the undeniable truth that I had moved forward without needing him to validate my existence. The night wore on, and I found myself cleaning again, not out of obligation, but out of a sense of ritual, a need to mark the transition from old habits to new resolve. I polished the silverware, arranged the glasses, adjusted the lights on the tree, and in doing so, felt a sense of control that had been absent for far too long. I realized that for years, I had tied my happiness to his presence, had allowed my identity as a father to be defined by his choices. Tonight, that changed. Tonight, I would redefine what Christmas meant to me, and in doing so, I would set the stage for a revelation he would never forget. As I sat back down, glass of wine in hand, I thought about the quiet power of subtlety. The decisions we make don't always have to be loud or dramatic to be effective. Sometimes, the smallest, most deliberate choices carry the most weight. I had spent decades giving, sacrificing, forgiving, and loving. And now, it was time for me to act not out of anger, but out of principle, out of a recognition of my own value. I would create a Christmas that mattered, and in doing so, he would see, perhaps for the first time, that I was more than someone to be taken for granted. The snow outside continued to fall, the world outside quiet and peaceful. Inside, I felt a shift, subtle but undeniable. A plan was forming, a quiet, deliberate action that would reclaim my dignity and force him to see the consequences of his absence. And as I sat there, letting the warmth of the fire seep into my bones, I smiled. Not a triumphant smile, not a bitter one, but a calm, steady acknowledgement that I was finally ready. Ready to act. Ready to reclaim my life. Ready to make this Christmas, and the choice I was about to make, unforgettable. For the first time that night, I felt a strange mixture of peace and anticipation. I had been hurt, yes, but I was no longer helpless. The night stretched before me, filled with possibilities, and I allowed myself to imagine the look on his face when he realized that I was no longer waiting for him, that I had taken control of the story that had always belonged to me. And in that imagined moment, I felt a thrill, a quiet satisfaction that was mine and mine alone. Tonight, I would reflect, I would plan, and tomorrow I would act. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the lights on the tree twinkled, and I raised my glass in a silent toast to the new chapter I was about to write. A chapter where I was no longer defined by absence, but by presence. Where I was no longer waiting, but moving forward. Where I was no longer a man at the mercy of someone else's choices, but a man in full command of his own destiny. And somewhere deep down, I knew, this Christmas, my son would finally understand, in a way he had never anticipated, the value of the father he had left behind. The morning after Christmas Eve arrived quietly, as if the world itself understood the weight of the night before. I woke to a soft light spilling through the curtains, dusted with frost from the overnight snow. The house felt different now, not empty in the same way it had yesterday, but still heavy with expectation. I made myself a cup of coffee and moved through the kitchen with calm deliberation, carrying the warmth of the liquid in my hands as I thought about what I wanted this Christmas to become. It wasn't enough to sit and wait. Reflection had given me clarity, but clarity alone wouldn't change anything. I had to act. And as I poured cream into my coffee, I realized that the first step wasn't about my son at all. It was about finding the life and the warmth that had always existed outside his presence. For years, I had measured my happiness by his attention, by whether he showed up, by whether he remembered the small, meaningful things. But there were other people in my life, neighbors, old friends, acquaintances who had shared moments of genuine connection. Perhaps they could be part of this Christmas in a way my son hadn't been. I thought of Mrs. Hendricks next door, a widow much like myself, who had always baked too much and shared it with me during the holidays. She had a gentle humor that could fill a room, and though she had her own children far away, she always seemed to make an effort to connect with those around her. And then there was Tom, the elderly man who lived 2 doors down, whose children rarely visited him, leaving him lonely for weeks at a time. He had once helped me shovel my driveway after a blizzard, refusing any offer of thanks or compensation. I realized then that there were people in this neighborhood who understood loss, absence, and the quiet ache of being forgotten. I decided to call them, starting with Mrs. Hendricks. My voice felt lighter than it had in months as I explained that my son couldn't make it to Christmas dinner, and I suggested that perhaps she might like to join me. I hesitated only a moment before extending the invitation. There was no awkwardness, only the understanding that we were both seeking something meaningful, something warm. By the time I hung up, she had agreed to come, and I felt a spark of anticipation I hadn't felt in a long time. Next was Tom. He was hesitant at first, muttering about not wanting to impose, but I reminded him that he wasn't imposing. He was bringing warmth into a home that could use it. By the time he arrived, carrying a small tin of cookies he had baked himself, I felt the house shift slightly. There was a quiet energy in the air, not the chaos I had imagined with my son here, but something steadier, more enduring. The presence of these friends reminded me that love could exist without expectation, that generosity didn't always require reciprocity. As the day went on, I continued to prepare. The turkey that had been meant for my son now seemed to radiate purpose in a different way. I basted it slowly, adding herbs and spices, feeling the familiar rhythm of cooking soothe me. Every detail mattered, not for him, but for the people who had chosen to be here, for those who appreciated the effort, the care, and the thought that went into it. I realized then that my actions, my choices, were no longer about chasing approval. They were about creating a space that reflected who I was, my values, and my strength. By early evening, Mrs. Hendricks and Tom had arrived. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find them both smiling, bundled in winter coats, eyes bright with the reflection of the twinkling lights inside. The warmth of their greetings washed over me in a way I hadn't anticipated. We hugged, exchanged stories, and soon I was pouring wine and setting plates, the room filling with laughter and conversation. I watched as Tom gestured toward the cookies he had brought, joking about his masterpiece, and I realized that this dinner, imperfect and unconventional as it was beginning to feel like Christmas again. The clock ticked on, and the sound of the door opening again made me pause. I hadn't expected anyone else, yet there was a sense that more connections were waiting to be rekindled. I hadn't thought about it in this way, but perhaps my choice to invite those who truly valued my presence would ripple further, attracting others who had been lonely or forgotten. The thought made my chest swell with quiet pride. I was creating warmth, not for the son who had abandoned me, but for the people who understood the meaning of presence and care. Still, as the evening progressed, a part of me couldn't ignore the absence of my son entirely. There were moments when the laughter around me triggered a pang of longing. I wondered if he would ever see what he had missed, if he would regret his absence, or if he would continue to drift, unaware of the depth of the love he had ignored. That thought, bitter as it was, became a part of the plan I had been forming in my mind. Not out of vengeance, but as a means to reclaim control over a story that had long been written by his indifference. While we ate, I made small gestures, simple but meaningful. I passed dishes, refilled glasses, and shared stories of past Christmases, memories that had once been mine and my son's alone. In doing so, I realized that these moments could be shared, could be celebrated, without needing the approval of someone who had consistently chosen absence over presence. And with each smile, each laugh, each appreciative glance from my friends, I felt the stirrings of a quiet power, a strength that had been dormant for far too long. As dessert was served, pies lined up in a row, each one a small triumph of patience and care. I noticed how the room seemed to glow differently. The firelight reflected off the faces of my guests, highlighting the warmth that had been missing in the house for years. I watched Mrs. Hendricks cut into a slice of pumpkin pie, her eyes lighting up, and Tom savor the first bite of apple strudel, with a look of delight that was almost childlike. And in that moment, I realized that the absence of my son had created a space for something even richer, even more authentic. The night grew deeper, and the conversation turned to memories, to stories of past holidays, to moments of kindness that had been exchanged over the years. My guests shared laughter and reflection, and I found myself listening more than speaking, absorbing the joy that had returned to the house. I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that my effort, my attention, and my care were being recognized, not by the person who had caused the hurt, but by those who truly understood the value of presence and generosity. Still, the thought of my son lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't help but imagine what he would think if he knew how I had chosen to spend the evening, how I had reclaimed the holiday for myself and for others. Would he feel regret? Would he understand the consequence of his absence? I didn't need him to answer these questions right away. What mattered was that I had acted, that I had taken control, and that I had created something meaningful in a situation that had once felt hopeless. The fire crackled softly, and I poured another glass of wine, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. The evening was far from over, yet I could sense that a turning point had been reached. The house, once heavy with anticipation and longing, was now filled with warmth, laughter, and the kind of connection that transcends obligation. I had discovered that Christmas, at its heart, was not about who showed up out of duty, but about the love and care that could be shared with those who truly valued it. As the night drew to a close, I felt a subtle shift within myself. The hurt that had weighed so heavily in the days before had softened, replaced by a quiet confidence. I knew that my son's absence would still leave its mark, but I had found a way to rise above it, to create joy and meaning in spite of it. And as I watched my guests leave, their smiles lingering, their gratitude expressed in small gestures and words, I knew that I had taken the first step toward a Christmas that was unforgettable, not because of disappointment, but because of the choice I had made to embrace life, connection, and self-respect. In the quiet that followed their departure, I sat by the window again, looking out at the snow that still fell softly over the neighborhood. The world was serene, almost magical in its stillness, and I realized that this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when I understood that the power to shape my life didn't lie in waiting for others to appreciate me, but in deciding for myself what mattered. I didn't know what the next Christmas would bring, or whether my son would ever fully comprehend the significance of his choices. But I knew this: I had acted, I had reclaimed my space, and I had created a memory that belonged to me. And in that act, I felt a thrill that was quiet but unmistakable. The thrill of a man who had taken back control, who had turned absence into opportunity, and who had begun to write a new story, one in which he was no longer defined by neglect, but by the choices he made for himself. That night, I went to bed with a sense of anticipation and purpose. I didn't know exactly how my son would react when he learned of the changes I had set in motion, but I knew it would be unforgettable. And that, more than anything, was enough. For the first time in a long time, I felt the quiet joy of knowing that I had acted not out of anger, but with intention, dignity, and the firm belief that sometimes the absence of one person creates the space for something far greater to emerge. The morning after my friends had left, the house was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. Instead, it carried a sense of anticipation, of purpose, of a shift that had begun the night before. As I moved through the kitchen, preparing coffee and reflecting on the events of the evening, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. My son had chosen to stay away, leaving me to face the holiday alone, but in doing so, he had unintentionally given me the chance to take control, to assert my value in a way he would never forget. I had thought about the plan overnight, letting it crystallize slowly. It wasn't a plan of revenge, not in the petty sense. It was something quieter, more deliberate, something that would make a lasting impression not through anger, but through consequence and dignity. I had spent years giving, sacrificing, and bending myself to accommodate the people I loved. Tonight, I would reclaim that energy, that effort, and redirect it in a way that mattered. Not just to me, but in a way that would force him to recognize what he had taken for granted. I began by preparing the house for a surprise gathering. This wasn't just about inviting a few friends. It was about creating an experience, a living testament to the love and care that I had poured into my life, even when others had ignored it. I called a few neighbors I had known casually, but who I suspected had spent holidays alone. I explained that my son couldn't make it, but that there was plenty of food and warmth for anyone who wanted to share in Christmas. I could hear the hesitation in their voices, the surprise that someone was reaching out with genuine kindness. By the time I hung up, I had commitments from 3 more families who had otherwise been alone, each expressing quiet gratitude and curiosity. By late afternoon, the house began to fill. The smell of roasting turkey mingled with the crisp scent of pine from the tree, creating a warmth that seemed to penetrate every corner. I welcomed each guest with the same care I had, once reserved for my son, offering a handshake, a hug, a small word of comfort. The room began to hum with conversation, laughter, and the subtle chaos of many people finding connection in an unexpected place. And through it all, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This Christmas was alive, not because of the absence of my son, but because of the presence of people who truly appreciated the effort, the care, and the love that went into it. Yet, even in the joy of this new gathering, I didn't forget my son. Part of the plan was still waiting, still quietly in motion. I had prepared a small gift for him, though he was not here to receive it immediately. It wasn't extravagant, nor was it meant to be. Inside the box was a handwritten letter, a simple yet powerful document that reflected the love, disappointment, and dignity that had been ignored for years. I had written it slowly, carefully, choosing words that would convey the gravity of the choice I was about to reveal. It wasn't a threat or a plea, it was a reflection of reality, of consequences, and of the fact that life moved forward, with or without his recognition. As the evening progressed, I watched the faces around me. People were sharing stories, swapping memories, exchanging laughter and warmth. I realized then that this was the true essence of Christmas: connection, presence, and shared humanity. My son had chosen absence, but in doing so, he had allowed me to create a space where gratitude, respect, and care were not just given, but recognized and returned. I felt a sense of empowerment, a quiet pride that radiated from my chest and settled over the room like a gentle glow. When the meal was over, and the dishes had been cleared, I gathered everyone in the living room. The fire crackled, casting soft shadows across the faces of my guests. I spoke softly but deliberately, explaining that my son had been unable to attend, and that while his absence was felt, it had also created an opportunity to share this holiday with those who truly valued connection. There were nods, murmurs of agreement, smiles that carried more weight than words could convey. In that moment, I felt the full impact of my choice. I had reclaimed the holiday, not through force or anger, but through deliberate action, generosity, and the quiet power of presence. Finally, it was time for the letter. I lifted the small box from the mantel and held it in my hands, feeling the weight of the paper inside. I explained that this was intended for my son, a message he would receive in due course, reflecting the consequences of his absence and the recognition that life moves forward with, or without, acknowledgement. I told the room that sometimes the most powerful lessons are learned not through confrontation, but through example. And as I placed the box in a prominent place, ready to be mailed or delivered later, I felt a calm certainty that this action, subtle as it might seem, would be unforgettable. The night continued with laughter, music, and conversation. My guests stayed late, expressing gratitude for the warmth and care they had received. I noticed how the room seemed to glow differently than it had when I had imagined it filled with my son. Brighter, richer, more authentic. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I had acted not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of a recognition of my own value. I had created a Christmas that mattered, a Christmas that reflected who I was, rather than who I had been waiting for. As the last guests left, the snow still falling softly outside, I stood by the window and looked at the tracks left in the yard. The footprints of those who had arrived brought a sense of closure and accomplishment. I felt a quiet thrill, a deep satisfaction that I had transformed disappointment into purpose. The absence of my son, once a source of pain and despair, had become a catalyst for empowerment, a vehicle for reclaiming control over my life and my happiness. Later, I sat alone by the fire, glass of wine in hand, reflecting on the evening. The letter I had prepared for my son remained in its box, a tangible representation of the choice I had made. I imagined him reading it days later, the surprise, the shock, the realization of what his absence had meant. He would see that I had acted not to punish, but to reclaim. He would see that life continued, that love could be shared, and that absence does not diminish presence unless we allow it to. I felt a sense of liberation I hadn't known for decades. The hurt that had once defined my Christmases had softened, replaced by clarity and purpose. I understood now that my power was in my choices, in the actions I took when faced with disappointment, in the ability to transform absence into meaning. My son's absence had created space for connection, warmth, and reflection, not only for those who were present, but for myself as well. And in that quiet, glowing moment, I knew the twist of this Christmas had revealed itself fully. The lesson wasn't for me. It was for him. The absence that had caused pain had led to presence, not of my son, but of a life lived on my own terms. The dinner, the guests, the laughter, the warmth, all of it had been a demonstration, a subtle but powerful message that love, care, and respect are not owed, they are cultivated, and their value is recognized by those who are willing to see it. I took a deep breath, letting the firelight warm my face, and felt a sense of completion. This Christmas, I had acted decisively, deliberately, and with dignity. The absence of my son had not broken me. Instead, it had given me an opportunity to create a memory, an experience, and a lesson that would be remembered. Not through confrontation, but through quiet, undeniable presence. And as I prepared to retire for the night, I smiled to myself, knowing that the next time he encountered the consequences of his choice, he would finally understand the weight of absence, the power of action, and the value of a father who had stopped waiting and started living. The morning after the unexpected Christmas gathering, the house felt different. The silence was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was filled with the echo of laughter, warmth, and connection from the night before. The memory of the smiles, the stories, and the shared joy lingered in every corner. I moved through the room slowly, letting the calm settle into my bones. I had done something remarkable, though quietly, deliberately, and without fanfare. I had reclaimed the holiday, turned absence into presence, and restored a sense of dignity I hadn't realized I had been missing. As I sipped my coffee and looked out the window at the snow still clinging to the branches, I thought about the letter I had prepared for my son. I had sent it the night before, discreetly, so it would arrive today. I didn't expect a response immediately, and that was fine. This wasn't about confrontation, pleading, or provoking guilt. It was about showing him, through consequence and quiet action, that life moves forward, and that love and respect are earned and recognized by those willing to acknowledge them. By mid-morning, the mail arrived, and with it, the envelope. I didn't open it right away. I knew what was inside, and part of me wanted to let him feel the weight of his absence first, just for a moment, before he understood the message fully. When I finally did open it, I read through my words carefully, reflecting on the tone and intent. I had written about the years of care, the sacrifices made, the hope for presence, and the disappointment of repeated absence. But I had also written about dignity, resilience, and the ability to create joy despite hurt. I made it clear that the holiday had gone on beautifully, with friends and neighbors who valued presence and connection. A subtle but undeniable statement that I had acted, and acted wisely. The rest of the day passed in quiet reflection. I found myself tidying up after the previous night's gathering, enjoying the rhythm of small, deliberate actions. The house was warm, the fire crackled softly, and the tree lights still twinkled. There was a sense of completion, of purpose, that I had not felt in years. I realized that for the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to validate my happiness. I had created it myself, carefully, deliberately, and with intention. The sense of empowerment was intoxicating, a quiet thrill that filled me with pride. Late in the afternoon, I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My heart skipped a beat, not with hope, but with anticipation. I knew it was him. I had expected he might come eventually, driven by curiosity, guilt, or a simple desire to see the house, and now that moment had arrived. I stood by the door as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the subtle signs of the gathering I had orchestrated. The remnants of laughter, the faint scent of food, the warmth that lingered in every corner. "Dad," he began, hesitation in his voice, a mixture of guilt and surprise. He had expected an empty house, cold walls, and silence. Instead, he was met with evidence that life had moved forward without him, and that I had chosen to fill the space with connection, appreciation, and warmth that he had taken for granted. I welcomed him with a nod, calm and steady, letting the silence speak as much as my words might. "I'm glad you're here," I said simply. Not angry, not pleading, just acknowledging his presence. He shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing for the first time that absence has consequences, and that those consequences are not always about punishment, but about recognition, awareness, and understanding. We sat together at the table. Not the empty table from the night before, but one still set with the care and attention I had always given to family gatherings. I poured him a glass of wine, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could see the wheels turning in his mind. The realization of what he had missed, the acknowledgement of the moments he had forfeited. There was a tension in the air, not confrontational, but charged with unspoken understanding. Finally, he spoke. I got your letter," he said, voice low. "I didn't realize, I knew I'd missed things, but—" He trailed off, his expression a mix of regret and introspection. I listened, letting him find the words, letting him confront the weight of his absence. I could see that he was beginning to understand, though it was his realization, not mine, that would carry the lesson. "You made this beautiful," he said eventually, gesturing toward the house, the lingering warmth, the faint traces of last night's gathering. I didn't think you'd—" His voice faltered again. I didn't need to finish his thought. The message was clear. He had underestimated me, underestimated my ability to reclaim the holiday, and in doing so, he had been confronted with a quiet, but undeniable truth: absence has consequences, and presence carries its own weight. I nodded slowly. "Life moves forward," I said softly. With or without acknowledgement, I chose to fill the space with people who value it, who see it, and who appreciate it. That's all. My tone was calm, deliberate, free of judgment. The lesson was delivered not with anger, but through example, through the subtle power of action and choice. He remained silent for a moment, then looked at me with a mix of humility and awe. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I didn't realize how much this mattered, how much you matter." There was no theatrics, no dramatic confession, just the quiet acknowledgement of understanding, the first step toward reconciliation. I didn't need him to say more. The recognition was enough. We spent the rest of the afternoon together, not rushing, not overcomplicating the moment, but simply sharing presence. We talked about the gathering, the friends and neighbors who had attended, the warmth that had filled the house. I could see him reflecting, quietly realizing that life, connection, and love are not owed, but cultivated, and that neglect carries its own silent lessons. As evening approached, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The house, once heavy with disappointment, was now filled with calm understanding. I had acted decisively, deliberately, and with dignity, transforming hurt into a lesson that was subtle but powerful. My son's presence, now tempered by reflection, was no longer the measure of my happiness. I had created that myself. Later, when he left, there was no dramatic resolution, no grand gestures, just a quiet understanding, a sense of boundaries respected, and a recognition of the power of action over expectation. I watched him drive away, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and serenity. I had reclaimed not just Christmas, but my own sense of self, proving that absence does not diminish presence, and that dignity and deliberate action are more powerful than resentment or anger. In the days that followed, the house returned to its ordinary rhythm, but the memory of that Christmas lingered. I found myself smiling at the quiet moments, recalling the warmth of the gathering, the laughter, and the subtle triumph of reclaiming control. My son eventually called again, a tentative voice expressing gratitude and acknowledgement. I listened calmly, letting the conversation unfold naturally, aware that the lesson had been delivered, not through confrontation, but through action, reflection, and quiet empowerment. I realized then that the true meaning of Christmas and of life was not about expecting presents from others, but about creating joy, connection, and purpose on one's own terms. The hurt I had felt was real, but it had been transformed into something lasting, meaningful, and powerful. I had acted not out of anger or spite, but out of principle and self-respect, and in doing so, I had set a precedent that would resonate far beyond a single holiday. That year, I went to bed on Christmas night with a sense of fulfillment I hadn't known in decades. The house was quiet, the fire burned low, and the snow outside reflected the light of the tree in soft, shimmering patterns. I thought about my son, about the lessons he had learned, and about the life I had reclaimed for myself. And in that moment, I understood fully that dignity, presence, and deliberate action are the most powerful gifts we can give ourselves. Gifts that, when realized, have the power to transform relationships, restore respect, and create memories that endure long after disappointment has faded. I smiled, letting the quiet satisfaction wash over me. The absence that had once brought pain had become a catalyst for growth, understanding, and empowerment. I had acted, and in doing so, I had turned a moment of heartbreak into a Christmas that would be remembered, not for what was missing, but for what had been courageously reclaimed. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that I had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that true love and respect are reflected not just in presence, but in the choices we make when faced with absence, and that a man who knows his worth can transform even the deepest disappointment into lasting triumph.